like the fact that they are all living together, with also Colombian returnees coming back to the same places, and often in indigenous, impoverished communities in Colombia in the first place. So thanks for this reminder. I'm going to pass on the floor to Beth Ferris. She's very well known in many circles, but just for those who meet her for the first time, she's a research professor at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. In 2016, she served as a senior advisor to the UN General Assembly Summit for Refugees and Migrants in New York, which led, and we were reminded of that in the first plenary session, to the two global compacts, the one on safe, orderly, regular migration, and the one on refugees. And she has been working a lot with the Brookings Institution and London School of Economics on internal displacement. So over to you, Beth.
Thanks a lot for this opportunity, and kudos to the organizers for putting this issue on the agenda. The issue of internal displacement needs a lot more attention. I'm going to step back and look at how internal displacement is faring these days, more from a global governance perspective, if you will. I think we're going to look back at the whole issue of IDPs and how they were treated by the international community as one of the great human rights success stories of our time. It was only 20 or 30 years ago where there were no discussion of rights of people who were forced to leave their homes but couldn't make it to or across an international border. Today you hear the term IDPs, at least in humanitarian circles, all the time. And yet I fear that we're losing momentum, that this was an issue that with the guiding principles in 1998 and the World Summit in 2005 and the Kampala Convention in 2009. But in the last few years, it seems there's less interest. Neither of the global compacts do more than mention internal displacement in passing. And yet the numbers are enormous. Of the world's 70 million displaced people, over 40 million are IDPs. And yet, and I'm a big supporter of Filippo Grandi, but did you notice in his little intervention that he went straight from 70.1 displaced in the world, double the number of 20 years ago, but never mentioned the 2/3 of those 70 million who were displaced internally. He went right to refugees. And certainly, refugees and migrants generally need a lot of attention and support. But there's this very large group of people, some of whom are more vulnerable to violence because they're closer to the conflicts than refugees who make it across the border, and because they depend for protection on their state, such as Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, countries where human rights standards are not usually at the top of the agenda. So what needs to be done? As Cecilia mentioned in her introduction, a lot of work needs to be done at the local and national level. But there was a time when lots of governments were adopting new laws and policies, but that seems to have slowed down. And furthermore, just adopting a national law or policy isn't nearly enough. Phil Orchard, Australian academic, published a book this year where he analyzed 40 governments that have adopted laws and policies on IDPs. Of those 40, he said only 12 are substantively implementing parts of those laws and policies. We need much more monitoring of what happens when a government passes a law or a policy. Do IDPs themselves benefit? On the operational level, internal displacement was the reason for the famous cluster system, humanitarian reform of 2005. And yet there are still lots of problems in the operational response to IDPs. There's still no single UN agency who's responsible for IDPs. It kind of goes back and forth. Frankly, sometimes it's very much decided on an ad hoc basis. There's a lot of institutional turf competition between agencies with who's going to take the lead. And so we still need to work on how the international community, as well as national and local governments, are responding. Perhaps the greatest weakness of the whole system right now is the lack of attention, a lack of success when it comes to solutions. As we've heard, internal displacement lasts a long time. Every single IDP I've talked to, and refugee for that matter, thought their displacement was going to be temporary. I'm going to wait a few months till things calm down. And yet when that displacement drags on for years or decades and kids grow up as IDPs, a different dynamic and a different set of actors are needed to help resolve that displacement and find some solutions. Walter Kalin has called on the international community to focus more on collective outcomes. Can we all work together and agree that we're going to assist X number of IDPs be locally integrated or return to their communities or move someplace else? We need to focus more on the outcomes of our action and not just on the many activities that frankly are a lot easier to report on and get funded than when you're talking about outcomes that affect the lives of people. Fine, I just want to throw out a few ideas that are circulating around of how to get more international attention on IDPs, particularly after the global compacts. One suggestion, probably the one with the best chance of success, is to have a high-level panel. That's UN mechanism for studying, addressing, talking about, coming up with recommendations. As of last month, 57 governments have supported this in New York. We had a good example, the high-level panel on humanitarian financing a few years ago that came up with good recommendations accepted by states and so on. Another possibility would be for the UN to name a special representative of the Secretary General on IDPs. The UN, I love the UN, but it is a very hierarchical animal. And when you have a certain status, the special rapporteur we saw, Cecilia, reports to the Human Rights Council and does phenomenal work. But she doesn't have the same amount of clout to convene, for example, the World Bank or peacekeeping operations or others whose actions are influencing the lives of IDPs. Having a higher level official reporting directly to Antonio Guterres could elevate the issue. Or maybe it's time for a summit on IDPs. Some of you may recall how divisive the issue of IDPs was in the whole negotiation process for the New York Declaration. But having a summit or having a global compact on IDPs, if we don't just think about the outcome of those processes, but as processes, what they generate in terms of interest, ideas, best practices, studies, reports. How many thousands of reports came out about refugees and migrants as a result of the summit and the negotiations around the two global compacts? The unleashing of energy and creative thinking could perhaps be stimulated by some big UN meeting on IDPs. Finally, as a researcher, I have to call for more research on internal displacement. Look at the relationship between refugees and IDPs. When people can't find protection in their home states, they leave. I was in El Salvador not too long ago where the government estimates are that there are 75,000 IDPs. Other estimates are 3 or 4 times that number. But most people, had moved several times before they started a journey north. Furthermore, when refugees are returned to their country of origin but can't go back to their homes, they become IDPs. Look at Afghanistan right now, where Afghans are being deported from Europe, for example, rejected asylum seekers, can't go back to their communities, and so join the ranks of Kabul's or the country's internally displaced people. But we need more research to understand the dynamics of displacement, when and why and how people move, and what the outcomes are. So there's lots to be done, but I think an important first step is at least putting this on an agenda of an important meeting like Metropolis. Thank you.